Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wist. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Hello, Ginette Vincendeau. Please pitch to my audience your book, Jean-Pierre Melville, An American in Paris.
Well, it's a study of a filmmaker called Jean-Pierre Melville, who made only 13 feature films. And I was attracted to writing about him because he's a very singular, original filmmaker, had his own studio. And around the time I wrote this book, about 20 years ago, his films were being rediscovered. He died in 1973, and so his last film was a year before. And there was a kind of crossing of the desert when he more or less disappeared from critical attention. So suddenly the films were being shown again, and I thought the work was remarkable. The other thing that interested me is that he was a filmmaker who was very much influenced by American cinema. He loved American cinema and American culture. He dressed like a kind of cowboy in Paris. And at the same time, I thought his work was very French. So it was that kind of double thing of being extremely influenced by American cinema, but also being very French that attracted me. He was very, as I said, very singular, original figure. He had his own studio and was a very independent filmmaker. And I guess the last thing to say is that his films are very beautiful, very stylish, and to me, he represents a period of French cinema that was really wonderful.
So, how would you describe Jean-Pierre's personal politics?
Well, he himself said he was a right-wing anarchist. But I think that generally speaking, his politics really were to do with the cinema. The cinema was his entire life, and although he did have some opinions, I think that what interested him was making films. The other thing that was very important to him arose from the fact that he had been in the resistance during the German occupation. And he admired General de Gaulle very much as the hero of the Free French, so that in the post-war period, he was very much regarded as a Gaullist, as a supporter of de Gaulle, therefore on the right. But to me, that's not the most important thing about him.
Okay. So who are his favorite American filmmakers? And also please explain the wider relationship he had with maybe his fascination with America as a concept.
Well, his fascination, I think one should start with that his fascination with America came from childhood, really. As a boy in Paris, he adored the cinema, and he went to see movies every day, and he particularly loved American movies, and he saw everything he could. He made a list of his favorite American films, which are reproduced in my book. But when you look at it, it's such a long list that virtually everybody who was anybody is on it, so that you can't say he was attracted to a particular filmmaker, but he loved the great classical era of American cinema, the films of the 1930s and 1940s and 50s. If one wants to pinpoint particular names, he loved John Huston. He loved so many people. He also loved some film, particularly thrillers, gangster films, and these were to have particular influence on him. So it's really his education was in watching American films. He also had a little camera that his parents gave him as a boy, and he started using it. I think more generally, you can gather his relationship, his love of American culture by, first of all, the name he took, Jean-Pierre Melville, was not his real name. He took it for his admiration to the writer Herman Melville. I think personally that he also chose it because it happens to sound French. And when he was very famous for going around Paris, driving, as soon as he had some money as a grown man, he drove enormous American cars around Paris. He always wore a Stetson hat when he went out, dark glasses. He just loved to look like a character in an American movie. But he also really had quite a deep knowledge of American culture in general and literature.
He was certainly a very stylistic filmmaker, and I was wondering, how did he develop his distinct visuals?
Well, I would say two things. First, he developed them by watching so many films and watching the films he admired. And what he loved about American cinema, to some extent, was the efficiency, the way the Americans could tell a story and hold an audience's interest. When you look at his films from the first one, Le Silence de la Mer, The Silence of the Sea, which he made in the immediate post-war period, to his last one, Un Flic in 1972, there's a change. There's a lot of evolution, and his films started by being fairly classic in their style, and as you go on, as you look at his films throughout the years, you realize that they become more and more stylized, pared down, and extremely tightly plotted and very carefully made. He was somebody who loved to control everything in the filmmaking process. And so when you see something like Le Samouraï, one of his most famous films, which he made in 1967, which is a gangster film, a film about a contract killer, it's a film that is almost abstract in its very pared down, it's very quiet. He uses sound in a very effective way. So there's a kind of gradual abstraction and stylization in his work, which he developed as he went on, really.
Who are some of the contemporary filmmakers that he hung out with? My favorite story is that he used to hang out with Lucio Fulci. I'm not sure that he. Some of the people he was close to at some point were the filmmakers of the French New Wave, like in the late 50s. People like Jean-Luc Godard, Claude Chabrol, François Truffaut, and I fell out with them later. But for a while, he was quite close to them. I think. Really, also at the same time, he was very much an individualist and a kind of solitary figure. For as long as he had his studio, from the 50s to the late 60s, when they burned down in 1967 while he was making Le Samouraï, as long as he had the studio and he lived there with his wife, but all the accounts of his life was that he was a very solitary, quite very individualistic, a very unusual figure. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I can say much more about that. Okay, so what can you say about his great scene in Breathless?
Okay, so in Breathless, Jean-Luc Godard, with whom he was a friend at the time, contrives in the story the fact that the young woman played by Jean Seberg must go to Orly Airport and interview a famous writer called Parvulesco. And that writer is played by Jean-Pierre Melville, wearing his hat and his dark glasses. And this was something which was very much a tribute by Godard at the time. Godard, like other filmmakers of the New Wave, was very much influenced by Melville, and in particular his gangster film called Bob le Flambeur, which he made in 1956. So this was an act of homage, of tribute to him, first of all. But I think that, and it's a very funny scene where we see Jean-Pierre Melville surrounded by photographers and people throwing questions at him. But the questions are not that serious at the same time. It's quite comic in some way. And quite a lot of the questions have to do with women, with love, with relationships. And I think that it's a way in which Godard uses Melville to put forward some of his views. But it's wonderful to have the scene because it's like a little documentary about Jean-Pierre Melville.
He's such a larger-than-life character, and I love his intonation. I think it's a great scene.
Yes, and he really milks it for comic purposes. I think he just loves playing this kind of original maverick character, which very much corresponds to how he saw himself at the time.
Are you aware of any unmade Jean-Pierre Melville screenplays?
Well, there are a lot of unmade Jean-Pierre Melville projects. Not many of them, if there were some screenplays, some of them have disappeared. Apparently, a lot of material was destroyed when his studio burned down. But he had a lot of interesting projects, including some films that were made by other filmmakers. Like he was interested in making Rififi, which was eventually made by Jules Dassin. He also wanted to make a film called Trois Chambres à Manhattan, Three Bedrooms in Manhattan, which Marcel Carné eventually did, which was based on a story by Georges Simenon. So he also then he had a project called Un Flic in 1956, and there is he did write a screenplay for that, which still exists. But that's quite different from the film which he eventually made under that name, which is his last film in 1972, The Story of a Corpse. So I think it's partly because he was such an unusual, idiosyncratic character, and actually quite a difficult man, very demanding. So a number of the projects he had sort of didn't come to fruition. He worked in a very independent manner, which is also why he was such a model for the filmmakers of the New Wave. So I think it's not surprising that there were. I think most filmmakers have a lot of projects that they don't end up making. So in that sense, he's no exception. But there's quite a long list of those.
So if people are listening to this and Jean-Pierre Melville sounds interesting to them, what's the film you recommend they start with in his filmography? Okay,
I would say this is very difficult for me to answer because I'm tempted to say, well, they should see all of them, and there are only 13, so it's not that many. Mm-hmm. I would really start, I think, with Le Samouraï, a film of 1967 starring Alain Delon as the contract killer. And because to me, it's like the most beautiful expression of his style. It's very, very pared down, and there are long scenes in silence, in a sense, without dialogue, but where Melville works on the sound in an extremely careful way, using background noises and so on. And to me, it really exemplifies the way his best films, especially of that later period, are both apparently very slow. Not much happens in some way. And yet at the same time, they're full of suspense. They're incredibly tense. The audience's attention is always held. So I think that most people fall in love with Melville when they watch Le Samouraï, Quite a few. I have taught the film with students, and very often they really love it. There are always one or two who don't like it. And so I think if you don't like Le Samouraï, then don't bother with the rest of Melville. But if you love Le Samouraï, then you will love the rest.
Which subsequent directors best represent the spirit of Jean-Pierre Melville?
Well, he's had a number of imitators. And in France, there's a filmmaker called Alain Corneau, who made a number of thrillers, very good thrillers. And he even remade one of Melville's best films called Le Deuxième Souffle, a film of the late 60s also. And but in fact, it's quite an interesting exercise to watch Le Deuxième Souffle by Melville and then by Corneau. And you realize that the tension that Melville manages to sustain in his films is very difficult to imitate. So where Melville has made an extraordinary gangster film, Corneau makes just a very competent one. And of course, there are international filmmakers like John Woo in Hong Kong, Quentin Tarantino in America, Jim Jarmusch, who all love Melville and to some extent have paid tribute to him. But I don't think there's anybody like him exactly. So he's had an enormous influence and as I said, a lot of imitators. Yet, actually, so these, you could say, are in the spirit of Melville, but none of them has really managed to, in my view, to make anything that approaches what Melville did.
He's certainly a singular voice, and a real original, and the book is fantastic. I remember reading it in 2015, and I couldn't put it down. So, Ginette, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Before I let you go, what do you have planned for the year 2020?
Well, I'm finishing a book by another French filmmaker called Claude Autant-Lara, who shares some characteristics with Melville. It was also very different. He's started making film a bit earlier. Was also a very difficult man. So I don't know what attracted me to this difficult man, except that they made some wonderful movies.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.